My name is Esther Kalu, and as you rightly said, I do more of cultural journalism, and before then, ventured into bits like Metro, where you meet vulnerable people and stories as such before delving into culture. So we'll be talking about protecting vulnerable voices, and this is a very interesting topic for me, because if there's something that I think journalism is one of the reasons that sort of inspired me to become a journalist and focus on documenting the stories of people, it would be that journalism gives us the right to represent underrepresented voices. It gives us the opportunity to give voice to the voiceless, and this is something that's one powerful aspect of storytelling and journalism that I think that shouldn't be taken for granted. Next slide, please. Next slide. I'm sure everybody has seen that. Okay. I'm not sure this is it. Can you go to the introduction? I'm not sure. Okay. Don't worry, you can just stay there. All right. So, in documenting or protecting vulnerable voices, it's very important that we understand what vulnerability is. And for me, I think vulnerability is something that you have to take into account, especially when you're dealing with vulnerable voices, because it's like being in a place where you're, for example, somebody that's usually they are strong. You probably have never even seen them cry, and you see them in this situation where they are crying, and for them it might be a lot for them. So understanding how to manage such situations, how to contain these emotions of vulnerable people in your story or in journalism is very important, because you don't want to put them in a situation where they feel embarrassed, number one. I don't want to put them in a situation where it's difficult for them to speak to you. So that's the importance of vulnerability in storytelling. Okay, thank you. I think this was the part where I wanted to talk about. So, as I mentioned before, when I said what inspired me to become a journalist, the most powerful stories in journalism or storytelling often feature the voices of people with little power. And honestly, I think that is something that I believe that it should drive every journalist, because it's easy for people that are powerful, sorry to say, but it's easy for them because, number one, they have the access, they have the connections, they have the money, to be able to do some things. But when you see somebody that's vulnerable, there's no money, they don't have access, they probably they have stories that, should be on the front page, but because they don't have all these things, usually there's no attention given to such people. So having a platform where you can use, to project and spotlight these stories of, people like this is something that is one powerful thing that I think storytelling and journalism should do. Next slide. Next slide, please. Okay, I think I've explained this. So let's just go to the next part. Okay, so that I don't dwell on vulnerability for too long. Like I said, this is the most vulnerable state of anybody, and it cuts across every area of life. It can be physical, it can be political. If you don't have the right to vote, that's already political vulnerability, because there's somebody you are interested in electing, for instance, or maybe you're deprived of even participating in election and all that. We have physical, maybe, for instance, poverty, the bad state of where you live, people struggling to even eat. So there's physical vulnerability. We also have the social, economical, environmental, which I think is very particular to, the cause of what we've been discussing since morning. Talk about, hazards like natural disasters. I think the moderator talked about flood, which has been the most recent, event that we've seen, flood in Nigeria, flood in Ghana. So environmental vulnerabilities like that. I know people that personally their houses were affected, and you can understand how vulnerable they are in even sharing the story to say, oh, my house, I couldn't sleep. My house was filled with, water and all that. Some people even lost their gadgets for work. And also, these are real life issues. It's not just for the sake of, talking about them. We also have academics. There are people that don't even have access to education. It's not like they don't want to go to school, but they don't have the access. So people like this are also vulnerable people that we talk about. So next slide, please. All right. So we've talked about vulnerability a lot. So we would get to know who are these vulnerable voices that we need to pay attention to. So we have the internally displaced persons. From where I come from, from Nigeria, insecurity is, I'm sure it's all over the news. There's so much insecurity going up every now and then. And this is one of the reasons why we have internally displaced persons. Some people have been displaced from their homes. They can't even go back home out of fear. There's war, there's just a lot going on. So people like this are people that you consider vulnerable people, because once upon a time they had a home where they were living. They had their families together. They could chase their dreams. They could do anything they wanted to do. And, just out of the blues, they have to run from one place to another to, for security and all that. So these are people that we can consider as vulnerable voices. We also have children, young people. Every family, there are children. So if a family is displaced, I'm sure there's a child among those families that are being displaced. So imagine a child that doesn't even know what is going on, being subjected to such, situations because of insecurity or, other issues that could have caused it. So we also have women and survivors of violence. Every day we talk about domestic violence, talk about rape. There's just a whole lot. And, survivors like this are also vulnerable voices when we want to capture their stories. We also have informal workers and waste pickers. They're also vulnerable voices. Population affected by disease. There was a time when there were, Ebola. We had Ebola, we have COVID-19, we have things like that. So for instance, if you're, covering a story that has to do with a family that lost, maybe a child or their family member to COVID-19, for instance, those are vulnerable voices because, number one, they're dealing with grief, first of all, and then they're also dealing with the fact that, a disease they don't even know, much about, in quote. Just took a member of the family out. So there are also vulnerable voices that we can consider. So let's just go to the next slide. So there's a whole lot of people when we talk about vulnerable voices. Next slide, please. And this is where it comes, the role of empathy. It takes a lot to have empathy, especially as a storyteller or as a journalist. Because it is not enough for you somebody tells you what happened to them. Somebody becomes vulnerable to you to, recount the stories of what happened. It's not just enough to say, maybe just sympathize. Like sometimes for you to be able to, write a story that is, human interest enough, you have to wear the armor of empathy, see yourself in that situation. Maybe you will not understand. And you might not exactly get the picture because you've not been there, but you can try to be. And just imagine what it would feel like to be in such situation and then understand how their mind works. And then what empathy helps you do is the ability to understand the situation, because you can't be writing a story about something you don't even understand in the first place. So you need to understand, what are these people going through? What does it feel like to live like this? Then when you're writing the story, it just helps you put everything together. So yeah, that's the role of empathy. Next slide. All right. So in all these stories, we also need to understand, the storytelling risk. Yes, we have we have a vulnerable voice that is willing to talk to you. Somebody has been raped. Somebody is being displaced. Just vulnerable voices are they are willing to open up to you. But it's not just enough for you to just pick this story and just dive in straight into it. There are storytelling risks that you need to consider. For instance, I think in Africa, this is not just Nigeria, in most African communities, this is very common, especially in cases of rape, where people are more scared of the stigma than, actually, talking about the story so that the perpetrator will be punished. So they are concerned about, what will people say? The family would not be tagged as, a family where, somebody was raped and all. So they are more concerned about such things than addressing the main issue. So for stories like this, you also need to understand that there will be a social stigma and discrimination if you are covering such stories. And you should be able to know how to manage such, so that because you are telling the truth about a child was raped, what if that child grows up all his life is, reduced to that stigma of a child that was raped, or you were raped and all. So it's very sensitive in that sense for us to be very careful in how we are reporting such story. There's also the emotional and psychological effect that it will have on the vulnerable voice or victim when you're also reporting such stories. There's also safety and security concerns. For instance, if the perpetrator gets to know that, this story is out, my name is out, what if the person has ulterior motive to do something more, to cause more harm to the victim, for instance. So all these things need to be properly checked and ensure that the safety of the vulnerable voice comes first before the story. That should be it. Because if they are safe, I'm sure we'll be able to tell a better story. But imagine telling a story and at the end of the day, you put the victim in more danger or more risk. You probably want to ask yourself if you have even achieved the goal of your story at the end of the day. So next slide. So because different people have different comfort levels with private information. I'll use myself as an example. There are some things that, regardless of how close we are, I may not be able to tell you. Not because I'm hiding the truth from you. It might just be because, to me, that's how much I think I can reveal to anybody. Personally. There are also some people that are willing to give you all the information you need, as detailed as you want to. So you should be able to understand people's comfort level to say, okay, this is what I think I can tell you, and respect it. Don't over push especially for private information that, at the end of the day might put the person at risk. Understand their comfort levels and know when to ask, when not to ask, what you should be asking, and so that you don't, at the end of the day, put the person in a very uncomfortable situation. So next slide. Okay, so I'm not going to dwell on this for too much so that I don't bore you. But there are two theories I want us to consider in talking about vulnerable voices. So the first is the media framing theory and the social responsibility theory. So media framing theory tells us how we can present our stories to influence how people think. And this is derived from the foundation of the agenda setting theory, which tells us that the media is good at telling people what to think about. So if you open a newspaper or you're watching a TV, there's usually the headline story that you have, the other sub stories, and also the headline story usually for every media house is supposed to be like the most important story of the day or most important story of the week, as you have it. So, but media framing theory is saying that in reporting such story, it's not just about prioritizing stories. You should be able to influence how you want people to think about the story, how you want the story, how you want when people finish reading the story, how you want them, how you want it to share, how you want their perception to be shaped. So when you write, when working on stories about vulnerable voices, you want to also be sure that the way you write, you'll be able to influence the opinions, the perceptions of people reading it, so that at the end of the day, they're not seeing the victim as, for instance, society has a way of always blaming the victim. For instance, somebody is raped and why was she wearing that clothes? She shouldn't have been wearing the dress in the first place. Or why did she pass the road? She shouldn't have passed there in the first place. Things like that. And so you don't want to put stories in that kind of perception that at the end of the day, the victim that you're supposed to be saving or supposed to be protecting becomes the one that takes the blame. So that is what the media framing theory helps us to do. Prioritizing stories and presenting it in a way that influences people's opinion positively, if that makes sense. And then social responsibility theory is saying that yes, as storytellers, we have freedom of expression. Yes, we have freedom to put out stories that we want to. But in putting out all these stories, we need to be morally and ethically responsible in telling our stories. So just because you have the freedom to tell story doesn't mean everything you get, you put it out there as the way it is. No, there should be a room for gatekeeping. There are some things that you necessarily can't put out. You have to withhold them. There's some information that shouldn't even be known to the public, and all that. So this is where your moral and ethical responsibility comes in as a storyteller and as a journalist. Next slide. Yeah, so picking back to what I was earlier saying about not giving out all information just for the sake of the fact that you have access, to this information. You should be able to know when what to publish, when not to publish, what to put and all. So anonymity and identity protection is very important for vulnerable voices, very, very important, because for some people, they're willing to tell you their story, but they're saying, I don't want my name to be out there. And you should respect that. Don't put out their names if they don't want their name to be out, especially for children. In fact, children, I think personally that anything that has to do with children, the best would be not to even use their real names. So, give them a pseudonym or something, especially because of the stigma that I mentioned earlier. So you should avoid revealing identifiable information like full names of the person, their exact location, because if you tell me the person stays in so street, so house, this is the color of the house, you've given me everything I need to go and meet the person and do whatever I want to do. So it doesn't help the victim, it doesn't help the vulnerable voice. You're not protecting them when you do that. So just don't reveal too much information and information about them and their family members to avoid being attacked or danger. And also consider carefully the consequences of the publication that the story that you're working on. Also consider the consequences on the vulnerable voice before you even think of publishing. And then I think for this will work better for videos and photos. So if you have photographs, it's best, especially for children, that you blur the images so that people don't have like a detailed view of what the person looks like or what's, just blur the images. And if possible, if it's video, when they're talking, you can change their voice so their voices are not really identifiable, but they are still telling the story. The story is what matters at the end of the day, not necessarily the voice. So if to protect them, it's possible to alter their voices, please do, so that at the end of the day they are protected. And then if possible, use pseudo and vague identifier. Okay, I think I mentioned this to protect the identity of vulnerable voices. Next slide. All right, so protecting children and marginalized group. I think the when we talk about vulnerable voices, I'm more concerned about children because Most of them are, still in their very early formation years. Most of them are they don't have anything, solid as adults. So it's a very sensitive stage to have such stories, tied around their name, tied around their identity. So this is a place where I think most we should be very careful about. And for children or vulnerable voices, control is very paramount, because you don't want to make the story about yourself. It is not your story. You're just how do I put it? You're just helping to push out the story, but it's not your story. So let the vulnerable voice or victim be in control of the story. Let them be the ones steering the story to say, this is what I want to talk about. This is how I want the story to be at the end of the day. And you also want to build trust and invest quality time. So follow-up is very important, especially because of how sensitive this set of groups can be. So you need to invest your time, allow them trust you. Like, why should they even trust you with their story in the first place? To tell you these things about themselves. So if you are able to build that trust, that will help. Also prioritize active listening. Listen very actively to every detail, every story, everything they're saying, so that you can use all the information to come up with something good. And also consider the cultural and societal context of groups. I think I mentioned before where I said communities, there are usually stigma around, vulnerable voices, especially when it relates to rape or domestic violence. So in writing this story or dealing with these marginalized groups, you also want to consider the cultural and social context of each community you're dealing with that the person comes from, so that you also know how to navigate that in writing your story or presenting your story. And then you need to ensure transparency and fairness in representation when you're also dealing with a marginalized group. For children, you need consent. Even if you are aware of the story that, I think there's a recent story, there's a journalist friend of mine that, the story around the demolition in Oworoshoki in Nigeria. I'm not sure, I don't know if anybody has heard of that. So he has been writing a proposal to talk about the story, especially relating to the vulnerable people that were displaced and no longer have a place to stay. And till date, the story has not been commissioned. And in that sense, he couldn't go ahead with the story. So imagine that he doesn't have consent, he doesn't have permission to go ahead, and he decides on his own to go ahead with the story. It doesn't make any sense, because you need the consent of whoever story that you want to tell. You need a consent, especially for their children, to include them in your story or interview them or get their stories out there. So you need that consent. It's very important. And then you need to understand the impact of retelling, especially for traumatic experiences. If I go through a traumatic experience, or anyone goes through, every time you retell that story, it's like you're feeling the pain all over again. So you don't want to put the vulnerable voices of victim in through that situation of telling the story all over or again and again, and then it's like you're putting them through the same traumatic experience to start recounting what happened, how it happened. So this is something that you want to be very strategic about, to know that the best way to get the story out of them, so that they don't have to keep going over and over it again and reliving the traumatic experience. And then be flexible in your interview. This is not a place for you to be rigid, to say, oh, this is how we do it. No, it doesn't. We know how the professional interviews should go, but these are vulnerable people and they are very sensitive. So you want to be flexible to, adapt into the best ways that you can get them comfortable to talk to you, to get them comfortable to, share their story with you. It might not be the rigid or the, professional kind of system that we are used to, but you need to be flexible in your interview approach so that you get the best of them and they can also be comfortable in talking to you. And lastly, to be that you should focus on the solution and resolution. Don't overdwell on the problem. We know the problem already. This has been done. This has been done. How can we move forward? That should be the goal of your story, not talking about the problem all over again. Okay, next slide. All right, so these are 3 case studies that I think speak exactly to the conversation. First, we have a story of 5 women. This was documented by the UN Women. It's a story of 5 women that faced displacement in their communities in Cameroon, I think. So if you read the story properly, there's the 5 women, after facing the displacement in their communities, some of them became social workers, some of them, founded NGOs of their own to start doing something positive in the community. So the end goal of the story is that, yes, we know the problem. They were displaced. They were displaced and can't go back home. But now there's more focus on the positive aspect of what their lives have become, what they are doing to get out of that trauma of being displaced from their community, being some of them even lost contact with family members. And also this is what this first story focuses on, and this is something this is an example of how a vulnerable voice should be protected, how a vulnerable voice story should be told, not necessarily dwelling on the problem that everybody already knows. We want to also see that, okay, despite everything that has happened to some of them, they are still making positive change. They are still, doing something good in the community. So that's what that story talks about. Then we have the second one that was documented by Premium Times. So this is a story of a young boy and some other children that were born into war. And the war that we're talking about is, the insurgency and the insecurity in the northern part of Nigeria. And from the story, if you watch, you would realize how emotionally and psychologically this, left on the children. And, all that. Some of them had dreams that of, becoming, I think this particular boy had a dream of becoming a medical doctor. But of course, he can't even chase that because every day is violence, this, violence, that. And, imagine a child of a 13-year-old boy that can't even have a stable life because of insurgency and insecurity and all that. So this is another story of, how we can report vulnerable voices. And I think the beginning part of the video, there's something very intentional that was done there. There was a video of a child playing, and it was intentionally blurred so that people don't see it. So this is something that's one of the things I mentioned earlier about not revealing, specific identities of vulnerable people, even in the course of telling their story. You shouldn't give out everything. And protection, that's the most important thing. And I think the last story also touches on that a vulnerable voice. This is a girl that doesn't have access to education, and an NGO came into the picture to help her start school and all. And this particular story, Tanisha is not her real name. It was just a pseudo name that was used. So it means that the real identity of the child we don't even know. But what matters is the fact that this is her story, and she has moved from not having access to education to having access to education. And at the end of the day, her identity is being protected, even at that. So agency and informed participation. We want to allow participants to understand how their stories will be used. Which is why I said the story is not about you. It is not totally your decision to make in how you want to put out the story. You want your participants to understand that your stories will be used so and so. Are you okay with it? Get their consent. If they agree with you, all well and good, you can go ahead with the story. Also, you need to see storytelling as a collaboration rather than extraction, especially because of its sensitivity. Yes, we all have, especially in today's internet world where trends in quotes are becoming the order of the day. So maybe in the course of, well, let me chase trend. It shouldn't be about chasing trend. It should be about, chasing something that this is people's lives we're talking about. This is people's, experiences, and it's not a joke. For somebody that, that probably saw their father being killed in an insurgency, or that, lost their mom or something, it's not a joke for something that we should consider as a trend to, just want to follow up the trend. No, it is a story that is very sensitive and requires, our emotional intelligence, our, everything for us to, take them very seriously and make sure that they are well reported in a way that does not put them in a very uncomfortable situation. Also, you have to give your source the respect to know what we will publish. So it means that after, writing your story, after documenting your story, you probably want to put out this, have a meeting with them to say, okay, this is what I've written about this story you told me. This is a documentary that we have about what you've talked about. And they watch it together. You watch it together with them, and at the end of the day, if both of you agree on it, fine. You can go ahead. But you need to respect their opinion in doing that. And also, don't be rigid in, honoring their requests. So, something like I mentioned earlier, this is how it is being done. This is a very sensitive story that we're talking about. It might not necessarily fit into what, house style or what the professional or rigid, patterns that we want. We have to be flexible in incorporating this sensitivity of the story. Next slide. All right, so we move to knowing when not to publish. This is very important. Like I said, it's easy for you to know, this is a story I think I should tell because it's very sensitive, it's this, is that. But the ability to also know when you shouldn't publish is very important. And for cases like that, you want to evaluate the risk and the reward. There's a story in front of you. The person has, narrated all the story to you, and then you want to sit back and reflect and ask yourself a very serious question. What are the risks of the story, and what are the rewards of the story? If the risks of the story, most of the time, if you outweighs the reward, I think it would be best not to even go ahead, because it means that publishing that story is going to put the vulnerable voice at a very high risk of, losing their job, facing stigma, or, anything, other consequences that might come along with just publishing that story. So you need to also consider that. And also you need to respect their post-interview withdrawal. You've done the interview, you visited the vulnerable voice, you've done all your follow-ups, you've done everything that you need to do to get the story out. And the person tells you, I don't want this story out anymore. Please and please, it is very important that you respect this, you respect their opinions about that. You might not necessarily understand why, and I mean, you might not necessarily even have the means to be able to convince them otherwise, but if they insist that they don't want it out, it is best you withdraw. You don't go ahead with the story. And also the mental and emotional capacity of your sources. So if at the end of the day, in telling your story, this is going to have a huge mental and emotional, you want to consider the mental and emotional capacity of, the sources in sharing their story as well. So if you consider this well enough, you should know when not to publish when it comes to situations like this. And as I said, it is not enough to just talk about, the problem. We want to talk about the solutions. So you should also consider the aftercare resources, or for somebody that is going through mental health, mental health stuff. What are the provisions you are making sure to say, okay, after this story, they're going to be, maybe you take them to a mental health practitioner, for instance, to help them deal with the psychological effects or what they've gone through. So things like that. So there should be an aftercare, which sort of are like the solution. So that we don't just dwell on the problem and leave it at that. And also the importance of confidentiality what they want to be confidential, please make it confidential and don't put it out without their consent. Next slide.
Hi, Esther. So, time to wrap up and we can take some questions.
Thank you. I'm wrapping up. Okay, so I think I've mentioned some of these risk assessment checklists that we want to, look over before we publish or, delve into the story. So I will just read out a few of them so that we can wrap up. We want to look at what is the likelihood that, bad abusers or oppressors will target or penalize vulnerable voices. Like I said, so you want to weigh that option and be sure that after you tell your story, the perpetrator will not start looking for the victim in their houses because of your story, because you've given them enough information to go and look for the person. So that's why they are coming after the person. So you need to be sure about that. And also ask yourself, will publishing this story put my source into will it affect their physical or mental well-being? And does the story narrative expose your source to unwanted public scrutiny or shame? Imagine somebody walking into the mall and they say, oh, that's the girl. They said that's the girl. That doesn't put them in a, you've sort of used your story to affect everything that has to do with their life. They can't go out in public anymore because somebody's pointing fingers at them. So you need to be sure of that. And then, other questions that you can ask yourself. Let's just go to the next slide. Okay, I think we're wrapping up. So the conclusion, like I said, I'll say again, is that the media through storytelling does more than just reflect society. It's not just though we are telling what is going on in society. The media through storytelling, through our narratives, we help shape public perception, and this is something that is very paramount with storytelling. In everyday life, you shape how you want people to see stories, to see certain things. For instance, you're talking about the zero waste and other environmental issues. It is through storytelling, how you shape the story can determine how serious people will take it or how lightly they will take it. So this is very important, and that's the power of media, the power of storytelling. So this responsibility lies in protecting vulnerable voice and then, of course, humanizing their reality, which, like I said, empathy, because when you put yourself in the shoes of someone, you sort of understand what it feels like to be in the person's shoe, and it makes it more human. So I think I've been able to cover that. Thank you so much for listening.